everyone, welcome to Collapse Astrology. Today we're going to take a look at the US natal chart, and in particular, its shadow side. It's pretty easy to see America's mythological interpretation of itself in this chart. It's pretty easy to see our exceptionalist national narrative, and I'll describe that layer too. But like every chart, this one has a shadow. All of the placements have dark potentials, and those are important to understand if we want to use this chart to accurately read what's happening in America right now. If you're new here, hi, I'm Hummingbird, a mundane astrologer with a background in history and politics. And on this channel, we talk about how the astrology of the past and present corresponds to the compounding crises facing humanity today. If that is your jam, be sure to hit like and subscribe, and consider joining the channel membership to support my free content. Also, come hang out live on Sunday evenings for Collapse Times, my weekly Astro News breakdown. Now, I've been studying the US natal chart for a long time, and I use a version that's pretty common called the Sibly chart. I'm going to go ahead and pull that up. This is a chart for 5:10 p.m. on July 4th, 1776 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The timing of the Sibly chart was determined in 1787 by Ebenezer Sibly, who was an English physician and occult writer, and there's some debate over its accuracy in astrological circles. Not everyone likes the 5:10 p.m. timing, and not everyone thinks that July 4th, 1776 is the best date to use for the birth of the US. To me, there are a lot of house placements in the Sibly chart that make a lot of sense for how I understand America. So I do resonate with Sibly's 5:10 p.m. timing for the signing of the Declaration of Independence. But the clincher, in my opinion, is that on 9/11, Saturn and Pluto were opposite one another, and Pluto was at 12 degrees of Sagittarius, which is the rising degree of the Sibly chart. Saturn was at 14 Gemini, so right across here on the descendant. And to me, that says that this chart is definitely an accurate measure of the birth of something that was directly impacted by 9/11. It would be a whole other video, obviously, to get into the details of 9/11, Lord knows. But to me, because of that alignment, it's hard to argue against the Sibly chart being a very important map or measurement of what America is. So let's do an overview of the chart to start. It has a Sagittarius rising, Cancer sun, and an Aquarius moon. There are lots of other Cancer placements as well, Venus conjunct Jupiter, as well as Mercury in Cancer. Saturn is squaring all the Cancer from Libra. Mars and Uranus are in Gemini, and Pluto is in Capricorn in the 7th house. We also have Neptune in Virgo, close to the midheaven. And I don't have a solid analysis of the nodes, which are in Aquarius and Leo, or Chiron and Aries in the 4th house. So I won't talk about those, but everything else we'll get into, as well as some of the current transits. So especially the sun, moon, and rising, these are energies that definitely fit America's self-inflationary national mythos. A traditional interpretation of the chart by someone who can't see beyond that mythos will say that the Sag rising is about America's gregariousness, its can-do spirit, its hardworking ethos, its passion, its multiculturalism. And the Sag rising is very appropriate for the US as truly the most multicultural country in the world. The many, many languages spoken here, the way there are many different ethnic enclaves in not just American cities, but even in many small towns in the US. So Sagittarius does just make a lot of sense as a description of that. The Cancer placements are usually interpreted as matching the inscription on the Statue of Liberty, which is a poem by Emma Lazarus called The New Colossus. And the words are, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, the tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." And I mean, these words really do evoke Cancer, the positive aspects of Cancer. The poem evokes protection, home, safety, respite, care, and that is the idealized personality of America. But as we'll get into, although this country has played that role for some, in almost all cases there have been strings attached. There has been an exclusionary nativism at home and shadow Cancer's manipulation through care in our relationships abroad. And then the third house Aquarius Moon, in an idealized interpretation, speaks to the Aquarian ideals embraced by America's founders and articulated in the Declaration of Independence. Freedom, justice, equality, democracy are all Aquarian yearnings, all expressions of Aquarius in its power. And in a mundane chart, the moon is usually said to describe the moon of the public, or like the masses. Although I think it could be argued that this moon relates more to the mood of the individuals who wrote the Declaration of Independence and maybe their fellow elites, especially because of the third house placement. So I'll come back to that. But to start off with the Sag rising, the shadow side of Sagittarius is evangelistic, fundamentalist, dogmatic, zealous. It believes super hard in something and it doesn't have space for any nuance or caution or tenderness. It runs over everything in its way like a forest fire. And so first of all, this is exactly like manifest destiny. Manifest destiny is a term that originated in the mid-19th century to basically justify and propagate the westward expansion of the white man into indigenous territories that weren't already colonized. And this awful picture you see on your screen is commonly associated with the phrase manifest destiny. Technically, this is called American Progress. It was painted in 1872 by John Gast, and it shows the quote-unquote American way of life in the form of a blonde, pale-skinned woman moving west, carrying a book or a Bible, stringing telephone lines behind her, bringing railroads, and chasing away the natives on the buffaloes. Manifest destiny implies something that is meant to happen, something that is destined by God, which is very Sagittarian, that kind of undying faith in something. We can also see this Sagittarius rising in America's more recent creation of its worldwide empire. It's 750 plus military bases in over 80 countries, according to the Cato Institute. Even if you go with a low-end estimate of 128 bases in 49 countries, it's still a massively widespread military installation spanning the globe and inserting itself into all kinds of different cultures. Sagittarius is associated with multinationalism. In a high vibe form, it's something or someone with a wide open consciousness that can hold all kinds of different histories and realities. But in this shadow form, it's America invading other countries under the pretense of spreading democracy and liberating the people, forcing a particular lifestyle and culture and belief system onto them. And I'll come back to this when I talk about the Gemini descendant, because as a lot of you probably know, even if the American mythos had a lot of the public convinced about the need to spread democracy around the world, for the ruling class, it was never about that. It was always about domination, installing governments that would let us extract resources and generally support colonial business interests. But the Sagittarian ascendant, so this point where an entity interfaces with the rest of the world, whether that be a person or a country, speaks to the American masses genuinely believing that our way of life is better and more advanced. And Christianity has obviously been a big part of that, the belief that we need to convert the natives or the savages, both on Turtle Island and around the world, in order to save them. But the more modern piece about democracy and freedom is part of it too. Again, the Sagittarian manifestation of believing blindly in something, dissociating from other realities because you're burning alive with your own faith. Now moving on to the Cancer placements. So the American mythos wants us to think of America as epitomizing high vibe Cancer. There's the Statue of Liberty inscription, which describes this country's taking in of immigrants, providing protection, safety, a place to call home, etc. There's also the image that we get through our public education that presents things like the Marshall Plan, which we learn to associate with America airdropping packages of food for European countries after World War II, as us taking care of people in other countries. That's particularly relevant since these placements are in the 7th and 8th house. And I've heard some astrologers describe the Cancer energies, especially Venus conjunct Jupiter here, as connecting to the abundant resources of the land that we're on. So let's start there, because the 8th house relates to inheritance and it relates to death. And America's resources were stolen through the genocide of the indigenous peoples of this land. They weren't passed down to us as a deliberate inheritance. They're more of a karmic inheritance, something that both elite and non-elite white Americans have exploited since the founding of the country. I'll say more about that a little later when I talk about Pluto across the chart in Capricorn, but for now, that is the oldest, most foundational layer of these Cancer placements. We stole the food, the shelter, the nourishment, and the beauty of this land from its original inhabitants. And even if it wasn't explicitly your ancestors that did it, if you're white and living in America right now, this thievery, this shady 8th house inheritance is your karmic burden. And then there's the nativism, which somehow has managed to run right alongside the idealization of the poem on the Statue of Liberty through America's entire history. There have been different waves of immigration throughout the country's history, and there has always been anti-immigrant sentiment. The earlier waves were mostly Catholics from Ireland and Germany who were resented by the mainly Protestant original American settlers. Then there were later waves of Chinese and other Asians, more Irish, Italians, Jews escaping persecution in Russia and pretty much all of Europe, Christians from West Asia, especially Lebanon and Syria. All of these were waves of immigration that happened before World War I. And then between 1924 and the end of World War II, immigration was the most tightly restricted. It slowly loosened after World War II until the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which was a much bigger opening. And the major influx of immigration from Central and South American countries that's happened in more recent years is mainly a result of the banana wars of the 20th century, and especially the super destructive right-wing coups sponsored by America in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So in all of those cases, yes, there was immigration, there is immigration. So there is that manifestation of Cancerian energy, an invitation to come home, find safety, find resources. But there has always been anti-immigrant sentiment and organized anti-immigrant movements and anti-immigrant violence here as well. And that's the shadow side of Cancer, the contention that some people belong and others don't. Some are welcome in and some aren't. It's also interesting to note that immigrants have always been put to work providing resources for the country's elite, whether that's food or other support structures, from the Chinese who built our railroads to Yorgis, the Lithuanian immigrant in the book The Jungle, who works in the meatpacking industry, to the Central and South American immigrants who do the bulk of agricultural work in America today. And then there's the international manifestation of the Cancer placements. In a mundane chart, the 7th and 8th houses are about a nation's relationship to other nations, its allies and its enemies. So here, especially since the end of World War II, America has built a mythology on being an abundant nation who gives generously to others. But shadow Cancer gives in a manipulative way. It gives with strings attached. It gives in a way that intends to make the recipients dependent on it or to control them in some way, to take away their autonomy. And so the first example of this is the Marshall Plan. Like I said before, most Americans associate the Marshall Plan with the images that were in our high school textbooks of American planes airdropping food onto war-ravaged European cities. But what the Marshall Plan was in a larger form was the US making huge amounts of loans to Western European countries who were economically devastated, not only because of the war, but because they had lost most of their colonies. They had lost the economic and military capacity to maintain their colonies, or at least to exploit their colonies as fully as they had for the past century plus. And so in making those loans to the European countries to help them rebuild, the US was able to make the calls about the way they rebuilt and to get them to restructure economically in a way that really went against the will of the common people, but a way that benefited American companies and business interests. There's a lot more history there that I would like to get into. For brevity's sake, I won't, but I'll link an episode of Upstream podcast. That's a good place to start for anyone who wants to learn more. So then there have been the economic institutions of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, which are basically run by America, even though they're technically multinational, and which have functioned the same way as the Marshall Plan in terms of economic colonization, mainly in the global South. Again, they make loans to poor countries in Africa or South America who it's important to understand were made poor by centuries of colonization and all of their natural resources being stolen. And then the IMF or the World Bank says, we'll give you money to build infrastructure, schools, etc., but only if you set up your economy the way that we want you to, which is with austerity, with very few social services, without nationalizing your natural resources. Oh, and you have to agree to allow Western corporations in to manage those natural resources. So again, here are Cancer's themes of land, homelands, security, and also the 8th house theme of shared resources, manifesting in a very exploitative way. And one other example of this is USAID. USAID has definitely provided tangible resources like food to countries that are having wars or where there's political instability. And a lot of the people who work for USAID or who worked for it before it was subsumed by the State Department are people who genuinely thought they were doing something good. But USAID and other programs like it are also Trojan horses, organizations that enter other countries under the guise of providing aid or education, but actually have CIA operatives embedded in them who do things like spread propaganda to support whatever right-wing group the CIA wants to fund in that country, and sometimes secretly provide arms or other material support for extremist groups. Like sometimes they literally have arms shipments inside boxes that are labeled as humanitarian aid. So there are some links below for anyone who wants to learn more about that as well. Now, I haven't mentioned slavery yet, and that's because I think slavery is best described by Pluto across the chart from all this Cancer. Pluto is in Capricorn in the 2nd house here. And I think this really describes how the United States industrialized slavery. Kidnapped and enslaved Africans were not immigrants, right? They were brought to this country as property, belongings, which resonates with the 2nd house theme of a country's own resources. And Pluto is not only war and death, but it also is about exploitation. And Capricorn is industry, business, capitalism, so the actual institution of slavery. And of course, it was enslaved people who were forced to work the land to draw out the tangible food, cotton, and other resources from the stolen territory. And so Pluto here is directly opposite Mercury in Cancer. And I think that this really speaks to the lie that the US tells about itself, our own big lie, if you will. I keep referring to the American mythos in this video, so the story that we're taught in school and just by our culture in general about our greatness, our exceptionalism. And I'm sure this video is pissing some people off if this is your first exposure to me and you didn't know what you were getting into, and if you still buy into that lie. Mercury in Cancer has a shadow side of defensiveness. It can default to emotions over logic. And people with this placement can be very emotionally persuasive. So this is an energy that can be very convincing, even if what it's saying isn't true, when it appeals to emotion and also to a person's sense of personal safety. Here in America, most of us believe the lie that hundreds of millions of people around the world just hate our freedom and that they want to violently attack us because they hate democracy so much. And I won't get into an entire excavation of that fairy tale right now, but like that is the lie. And this Cancer placement tells it very convincingly. But here it is, opposite Pluto, opposite the industrialization of oppression and murder that is actually what built this country, what still sustains it, and is actually why people from other countries hate us. And we'll just jump over to Saturn here since it's connected. Saturn is in Libra in the 10th house, and it's exactly in a square to the US sun. And I think there are 2 layers to this. There is a shadow layer, which we're seeing manifest now, but I think there is also a layer that's like a note of brightness in the shadows of this chart. And so Saturn and Jupiter are the only planets that are exalted or even in domicile in this chart. Both Saturn and Jupiter are exalted. I'll say a little more about Jupiter later when I talk about the transits, but I think that this Saturn placement is about America's court system and its judicial system. So Libra is associated with justice and with the law. Saturn is a figure of authority, of structure, of finality. And basically, although we're not seeing it working out this way right now, There have been many times over the course of America's history where the legal and judicial systems actually have moved the country in the direction of justice. Even at times when, like, a president might not have gone in that direction, or Congress might not have gone in that direction, the legal system has moved things towards actual fairness and balance. And so I think that's the exalted version that we're seeing here. But of course, that is not happening right now with the corruption of the Supreme Court, with the illegal deportations continuing against the rulings of federal judges. We'll talk about that a little more with the transits. And then, like I mentioned before, the Aquarius Moon can be read as the American ideals expressed in the Declaration of Independence of all men are created equal and endowed with the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But the writers of the Declaration didn't mean for all humans or even all men. They just meant all white Christian landowning men. So the Aquarius shadow of intellectual dissociation is one layer here. And at least some of the founding fathers did question the morality of slavery in some of their private writings, but it wasn't something they were taking into consideration in their political pursuits. They also didn't mean for these rights to extend to the indigenous people whose land they were colonizing, or even the indentured servants and other poor people immigrating from Europe at that time. There's also the layer here of America's political lineage, which I'm not sure if it's a shadow aspect, but just interesting to mention. A lot of the founding fathers' political philosophy came from two older European writers, John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose ideas were also very Aquarian. Locke wrote a lot about individual rights, the need for government to not be too controlling and centralized and let people manage their own lives. Rousseau came up with the idea of the social contract, which was basically about popular sovereignty, again, letting people come up with their own rules about how society should be run. And obviously, in today's world of rule by corporate entity under the guise of libertarianism, we might not have the best impression of those ideas. But back then, this was in contrast to monarchy, right? So it actually was pretty revolutionary. And all of this lack of hierarchy, decentralization, popular decision-making instead of decisions being made by a singular ruler, all of that is very Aquarian. Also, sometimes in the natal chart, a third house speaks to a person's inner circle. And so I think the third house placement of the moon here illustrates the kind of inner circle of the founding fathers, which, sorry for even using that phrase, it's just a lot to say the white elite men who founded America each time. But anyway, there just weren't too many of them. They all communicated with each other a lot, kind of bounced ideas off each other, which is a third house theme. So it's possible that another chart might better symbolize the birth of the official political entity of America, like maybe the ratification of the Constitution in 1788, for example. But in this chart, the third house moon speaks to the heart, the core of the Declaration of Independence and the ideals that it articulated and that were articulated by this small group of men. Okay, so now Mars and Uranus and Gemini are super interesting placements. They have everything to do with America's approach to war and the military. And I'm not going to get into a lot of details here because my video on the history of US Uranus returns and the military-industrial complex is a really deep dive. But simply put, Mars relates to a country's style of fighting, and the sixth house, where Uranus is, relates to the actual military, like the troops themselves. So the US has a very shadow Gemini, very two-faced expression in its military endeavors. And we've pretty much already talked about this with the shadow Cancer, but these Gemini placements describe the actual two-facedness of it, how one story was being told while something totally different was being played out. I'll just give the one example here of Operation Paperclip, which was the program that originated during the last Uranus transit through Gemini at the end of World War II, where the US imported about 1,600 Nazi scientists to be part of their technological development program. Outwardly, obviously, we were presenting an anti-Nazi face to the world, but secretly we were bringing in Nazis, and I mean many who were high up in the chain. I'm not just talking about obscure scientists from Germany. we were bringing in Nazis, giving them high salaries and fake identities, and putting them to work for the US government. And that's only one example of many, many things the US has done like this. I mean, the 9/11 wars are another just really overt example, saying we're going into Iraq and Afghanistan to spread freedom and democracy when it's really all about oil and influence. It has never been about freedom and democracy. I'm sorry, but we need to wake the fuck up from that story. But yeah, watch my video on US Uranus returns if you want to learn a lot more about Mars and Uranus in this chart. And the final piece I'll touch on is Neptune on the midheaven. And this one, I'll be honest, I don't have a really solid analysis of it as a natal placement. It is in an exact square to Mars, and that might indicate the religiosity that has always been a part of this country, but that doesn't really feel super aligned with Virgo. I'm curious if it might relate to Freemasonry, this kind of political occultism that some of the founders were associated with. But that is not a rabbit hole I've been down, so not really something I can speak to. But the thing I do know about Neptune is that its cycle has related to UAPs. So the first US Neptune return was in 1938 to 39, which was when nuclear fission was discovered. That was the major breakthrough that led to the creation of nuclear weapons. And as I talked about in my third Uranus and Gemini video, some people think it was that breakthrough that led to the major increase in UFO sightings that started around that time. Then the Neptune opposition was in 2021 to 2022, and that corresponds with the increase in UAP whistleblowers and mainstream press coverage that started in 2017 and has basically continued ever since. More on that some other time. And okay, so the last piece I want to mention is the transits. We won't get into the major long-term transits right now, but I want to talk about the Jupiter-Saturn square. So this is a chart for July 4th of 2025. And the Jupiter-Saturn square was exact on June 15th of 2025, with Jupiter at 1 degree Cancer, Saturn at 1 degree Aries. And so Saturn has been basically at this 1 degree all summer long, which is on the IC of the US natal chart. Jupiter came into Cancer, has been slowly transiting all of these Cancer placements. And it's just been wild, honestly, to see this playing out. There has been a non-shadow side. There has been a beautiful, empowering manifestation of these energies. And I'll finish on that. But first, the shadows, like, wow. So the ice abductions were really ramping up as the square was exact. So we have Saturn at the bottom of the chart, Saturn as an authority figure, an authoritarian in its shadow form. We have these ice losers in their masks and bulletproof vests or whatever. And the IC in a chart like this literally relates to territory, to land. And Aries in its shadow is violence, this unrestrained warrior energy. And then there's Jupiter in Cancer and the shadow Cancer that we already talked about, the nativism, the exclusionary energy, the lie about protecting the in-group from the outsiders. And this has not stopped, right? The abductions are happening still pretty much daily, but the worms were really crawling out of their holes as the square peaked in the middle of June. And then I cast the chart for July 4th because I thought this was so fascinating. Trump signed the Big Beautiful Bill on July 4th. And not only was that America's birthday, so you can see that the, suns are almost exactly lined up here, but also this was America's Jupiter return. That's a once in every 12-year thing, so it's just a pretty wild coincidence that it happened on July 4th this year, and that was the day of this bill being signed. And I just thought that this alignment really makes the shadow of the Cancer placements impossible to deny. Some astrologer, looking at this year ahead of time, not seeing the shadow side, might predict that this would be a year of abundance for America. But the bill slashes social services, increases funding to ICE, and gives massive tax cuts to billionaires while increasing taxes for the lowest income earners. And not just this bill, but this Jupiter transit in general is corresponding to the US dollar losing value on the global currency market. The dollar is actually having its worst year since 1973 this year. And this does seem to be part of the plan of the elites. In Trump's senile mind, the dollar losing value will help American companies by making our products more affordable overseas, and along with the tariffs, making products from other countries less affordable here. For the techno-fascists, possibly the dollar losing value is part of their longer-term plan to abolish fiat altogether and leap to crypto as part of their breakaway process. That's a whole other conversation. But either way, the dollar losing value isn't good for your average American. Right now, the stock market is still soaring, and so that's a little bit more of a classically Jupiterian manifestation. But that also really just speaks to the way that wealth inequality continues to expand, since although over half of Americans are invested in the stock market in some way, mostly through their 401ks, the top 1% of earners hold about 50% of the entire amount of wealth in the market. So overall, this Jupiter transit is not contributing to abundance for the majority of Americans. It is contributing to abundance for the elites. But to finish on a positive note, there were also some really beautiful manifestations of the Aries-Cancer contrast at the Saturn-Jupiter square, which are also continuing to this day. The square was happening at the height of the anti-ICE protests, especially in LA, where ICE has been most active. And not only protests, but there were people chasing ICE out of their neighborhoods, people rallying around detention centers. And so here we have Saturn and Aries as people claiming back their own authority, people refusing to submit to the externalized authority of ICE or the quote-unquote government, people treating the situation like the Aries survival emergency situation it is, and also a beautiful Jupiter and Cancer piece of people protecting their neighbors, protecting families that ICE was trying to separate, protecting kids, people extending deep love and compassion and empathy, people really moving not just from fear, but from an awakening of love in their hearts. So unfortunately, the abductions show no sign of stopping to this day. The protests and regular people just doing everything they can to stop the abductions as they're happening, or at least to document them, are also continuing. And we'll see what happens when Saturn moves back into Pisces in September. It's possible there could be some respite in the worst of the authoritarianism during that time, although it will really just be lurking beneath the surface, and it will probably reach a new awful peak when Saturn and Neptune are finally conjunct in February 2026. But let's keep doing everything we can to bring out the positive qualities of these transits and to bring light through even the darkest shadows of the American natal chart. All right, everyone, I hope you enjoyed the video. I'd love to hear what you think down in the comments. Let me know what I missed. And if you have any thoughts on America's natal Chiron or its nodes, let me know about those. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe. Join the channel membership for private live divination sessions with me. Follow me on Instagram if you're over there, and come hang out on Sunday nights for the Collapse Times weekly live stream. I will see you next time.